We have this notion of landscape as being this very passive thing, a scene, something in front of our eyes. And in my own work for a long time, I've really been exploring a more expansive idea of what landscape means. My notion of landscape has much more to do with the history of people in places. And I thought, what is it that we're not looking at when we look at any landscape representation?
I was interested in this notion of American art and who gets to decide what American art is. When there's one story being told or one narrative attached to what the American landscape is or what American art is, there is simultaneously an erasure of another narrative that's not being told. The works in the show are as much about what you see as what you don't see, and this idea of revealing and obscuring happening simultaneously. I'm not interested in representations of the landscape as passive. I'm interested in placemaking and the kind of mutable quality of places. I was very interested in the history of slash and burn amongst indigenous peoples. Historical accounts of the American landscape always have a description of this sort of virgin wilderness that was untouched by humans. And there's this notion that fire was a bad thing, with a complete sort of erasure of the history of how, in fact, the American landscape was shaped precisely by setting deliberate fires. When I create these images, I'm interested not just in the image itself, but in the materiality of the image. In this case, the clay has been fired at a very high temperature to create an image of fire. The image itself is being produced by the same image that I'm creating in the artwork. As the viewer walks in front of the piece, it's a mutable surface that changes all the time in front of your eyes, and then it changes in response to your presence moving in front of it. Even though I don't represent any figures in the work, there is always that sense of the viewer participating in the work, much like a figure in the landscape in traditional painting, where you're constantly looking for yourself and finding your own reflection superimposed on the image of the artwork.
When I begin to work on a piece, the first thing I do is I ask myself this very simple question of where am I? Where am I culturally, historically? What are my coordinates? Where am I physically standing? And this particular site in Madison Square Park was really interesting to me because the Flatiron Building, at the time that it was built, was one of the tallest buildings in New York City. And in many ways, this particular part in the city really speaks to our history of looking up. And the piece is designed to be for the ambulatory viewer. So you're meant to be seeing it while you're walking. And the images sort of unravel as you move under it. So in a way, it's making this correlation between your grounded motion of walking on the path and connecting that to what's above you. Gold as a material has always been really fascinating to me because it's a material that's mined from underground, and I often use mined materials in my work. But I'm using it to speak about something that's sort of heavenly and above your head and the cosmos. I'm using it to speak about light. My works really depend on the presence of the viewer in order to make sense. It's almost as though if you don't have people present, reflected in it, moving through it, there is no work. It's just an object. The work really is that intersection between people moving through the work and becoming a part of it. I wanted to explore this kind of history that we have as human beings of looking up to the night sky for information. The title for the show is Night Writing. Night Writing is a reference to a code of communication that was designed in the early 1800s. Napoleon issued a demand to have
a secret code of communication devised where his soldiers could communicate at night. One of the captains in his army, named Charles Barbier, designed what we think of as night writing. There's actual text in the work, so there's kind of epic text that's been translated into Braille and superimposed on the images. It's a kind of total abstraction of language, so that the language of Braille and the language of the text completely obliterate one another. The imagery, which is really the last part of my process, the Aurora Borealis just seemed like the perfect vehicle to explore it because it's completely abstract, it's completely natural, but it looks completely artificial. The big installation, which actually came later in the idea for this show as a way of contextualizing the paperworks, I really wanted to be able to place the viewer in an experiential version of what the images represented. What it's really trying to do in here is take advantage of this incredible high ceiling and the natural light that filters through the skylights. It really is almost like doing a painting in the air. One of the challenges always in my work is to really transcend the material. And so while it's plastic and it's big and it's kind of heavy and it's very object-like, the goal is to use it in a way where it completely transcends what it is and just becomes pure effect. As the light changes throughout the day, it's really beautiful because earlier in the morning, like at 10 a.m., the light just filters right through, and there's this very sort of beautiful pink aura to the whole space. And if you come closer to 5 or 6 in the evening, when the sun starts setting, the tubes start to get really kind of somber and more purplish, and the whole mood of the room changes. The piece takes its title from a collaboration between Avedon and James Baldwin that was done in 1964. The idea was to create an artwork that was sited in this sort of iconic, very sacred, very protected place in the identity of Harvard's campus, and to make people be in that space in a slightly different way than they're normally accustomed to. The structure of the piece consists of many concentric circles made out of polycarbonate tube. This physical structure, but also this social structure that's invisible, that's sort of laid over the piece. Layers of concentric engagement, from the private act of an individual to all of the versions of the Harvard community, which of course we know is not one community, but oftentimes a very segregated community. That is my hope for the piece, is that it becomes a site, an actual physical place where we are able to enact and think out loud and have a conversation with one another.